Hello, folks. Welcome back to WW2 TV and Artillery Week. And it's been quite successful so far. Peter Hart, with his impressions yesterday, is always incredibly good value. But today's show, we're looking at the role of artillery again, but in kind of how it works within the doctrine. And we'll talk about some particular stories in the Normandy campaign. My guest is a former British Army gunner who goes under the name of History Explorer, and he has a YouTube channel, the link of which is in the description below. But I'm going to bring Rob in now. So good evening, Rob. How are you today?
Hey, good evening, Paul. I'm great. Thanks, mate. How are you?
I'm very well. So artillery, the themes so far this week have been that it doesn't get enough credit, and it's seen as the machinery, it's seen as the tubes themselves and less the personnel. And sometimes because of being a bit behind the lines, so to speak, not in the immediate action, although gunners would argue with me, it doesn't kind of get the same prestige as sort of tankers and infantry. Is that something you kind of genuinely agree with?
100%. Absolutely. I mean, the gun itself is the ordnance, the weapon is the projectile which we fire through the air. Yeah. And so it's not necessarily as sexy as when you're talking about maneuver warfare and infantry, you know, fixing bayonets, closing with and killing His Majesty's enemies or anything like that. It's not quite as interesting, but I'm a current serving gunner, actually, Paul.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. Sorry, I terribly. That's my own mistake.
Retiring me early. I'm still young.
Yeah, no, it's because most of the people I deal with are old like I am. So yeah, it's just force of habit.
So you're absolutely right. I do think in a certain way, gunners are maligned, but I think it's because they're misunderstood.
Okay. Hopefully, so tell us about your channel and how and what you're doing with it and how people can help you with it, because it's really interesting, your project.
Yeah, well, essentially, the History Explorer channel has got it's got 260,000 followers on TikTok, and we're trying to grow it into YouTube. The whole point of the channel is to raise funds for veteran charities. So we take nothing away from the channel whatsoever, and people can support it, I guess, by essentially doing the things that you asked, Paul, which is, you know, come and watch the shows. Hopefully you'll like it and you'll like the video. Leave a algorithm enhancing comment and subscribe to the channel. And in doing that, essentially what that does is, it's just like you putting your hand in your pocket and dropping off your loose change into a collection box. My aspiration is hopefully in a year's time to drop off a check to SSAFA. I enjoy making videos and I love history, and why not combine the two and try and do some good?
Indeed, and it's a worthwhile project, and I've watched quite a few of your shows, and they're really good. And they're different kind of format to me. Everyone's doing something slightly different. People get you confused with JD at History Underground, but History Explorer, History Underground. Then there's the Wayfinder.
He's really slightly more successful.
Well, it's what's really great is the fact that we're all connecting with each other, because none of us are doing exactly the same thing, and there's overlap with our audiences, and also some of our audiences stick with one or other of us because it's a format they particularly like. But there's room for everybody, and there are people out there who are just devouring every World War II content they can find. But anyway, we're going down into the talking about YouTube. You've come on with a PowerPoint, so just tell me when to move on the slides. But we're basically talking about artillery and how it's used. So over to you, Rob.
Yeah, well, I mean, as part of Paul's Artillery Week, my presentation to you is on the employment of artillery, essentially. And the intent for this presentation is to convince all of you that artillery is indeed the god of war. So it's a bit of a tall ask. I'll do this in 3 phases. So the first phase is essentially setting the context, and I'll look at the divisional and the core involvement in what we call the deep battle. So I'll explain in fairly loose terms what the deep battle is. Second phase, we'll look at all of those factors at the gun end, all the way through to the trajectory of the projectile, which will impact the performance of these projectiles. So hopefully it will shed some light on some of the myths and the misnomers around the gunners. And if Willie is watching and he keeps calling me a drop shot, he will understand, where that nickname came from, why we're sometimes called drop shots. The third phase is all about forward observers. So please stick around to the end because we're going to hear a really humbling and quite harrowing tale of the siege of Hill 314 at Mortain. So hopefully that'll be really interesting to people. So I suppose the next part is to really say, what gives me the agency to talk to you about artillery? And really, Paul has covered that off. I am a serving artillery officer. I'm not a historian. My qualifications are all achieved in service. So the stuff that is augmented by my service. So I'm certainly not an expert, but I can talk to you about artillery. I suppose really we can crack on from there, Paul. So first slide, please. Right, first slide. You may well be asking yourself, why on earth is there a picture of T. Lawrence on the first slide? And really, this serves two purposes. The first one is I know that Paul is a big fan of Lawrence of Arabia, so
Yeah.
a bit of an influence campaign. The second point is that there is a great scene in Lawrence of Arabia where, you know, Lawrence has achieved some success in the Middle East and he's canvassing for greater resources. And so he says, you know, give me more machine guns. And the response is, of course, you can have more machine guns. Give me more rifles. I need thousands of rifles. And of course, the response is positive. Yes, you can have these rifles. Give me gold. I need money to pay these soldiers. And yes, the response is very positive. And same for armored cars. Give me armored cars. But when it comes to asking for artillery, give me field artillery, the response isn't quite so positive. And the response is, when you give them artillery, you make them independent. Therein lies the nub of this presentation, really. If you give someone the ability to fix and suppress the enemy position, then you make them independent. You provide the ability to have that maneuver. So that's something we're going to cover off, the basic building blocks of offensive action. At the bottom there, I've just got this tension between fires to enable maneuver. And when we say fires, we're talking about artillery, of course. So fires to enable maneuver, which is a very Western approach. It's something that NATO, we preach all the time. But to right of that, we've got, you know, maneuver to enable fires, which is more of a Soviet approach, certainly post-World War II, Cold War era. They will project their armored forces forward in order to get their fires assets forward to strike en masse in the deep, whereas we are looking to use our fires to enable our maneuver. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on fires to enable maneuver. Next slide.
Cheers.
Okay, this slide is just to build on that and expand on that to explain that those very basic building blocks of offensive action are scalable. So we always have an assaulting element, we always have our fire support, and we always have a reserve, or we should. On the left-hand side, looking at a platoon attack, you'll see that the fire support element is going to be a section. So the fire support asset there will be your machine guns. In this case, it's going to be a Bren gun. They are providing that withering weight of fire onto the enemy to keep their heads down. The assaulting element is, you know, the one that's fixed bayonets, is closing with and killing the enemy. This is scalable. So when you move up to the company level, which is just one along, you've still got those machine guns and that section which is providing that fire support, but you're then incorporating indirect fire with the company mortars and their heavy weapons. And again, if we scale it up to battalion or battle group level, you then start to see the introduction of artillery. So that's where artillery really comes into it if we're looking at this on a scalable sort of level. And again, fires enable the maneuver.
And just a quick question for you, Rob, because it's always interesting to speak to someone who is serving about terminology, because, you know, we still have not got to the bottom of deciding what a tank destroyer is. We're further away from understanding the definition of that. But within World War II, what do you find as artillery? Because when Richard Fisher comes on and talks about the Vickers machine guns, they were predominantly used in Normandy in the indirect fire. So, you know, smothering targets with indirect machine gun fire. You've got mortars as well. I mean, it sounds to me that in this use, they are fulfilling some of the requirements you're talking about already. So they could come under the artillery banner. But would you disagree with that?
I mean, they can certainly be used in that role. I mean, you can even use tanks in an indirect role. There is a mechanism for working out the beaten zone of tanks, even though you would consider them to be what we call a rigid trajectory. It's a very flat horizontal trajectory compared to artillery, which is a parabolic arcing trajectory. I don't want to get too technical, but, you know, they can be used in an indirect role, but, you know, their ranges are astronomical for tanks. So you're looking at a very long way for doing that. I wouldn't consider personally machine guns to be an indirect fire asset. I would definitely consider them to be direct fire, but they can be used in that way because they have a beaten zone. And we're going to come on to beaten zones in a minute, which is essentially, you know, this lozenge of where these rounds are going to land. They will never land in the same place twice. And that is certainly true of artillery as well.
Okay, cheers, thanks.
Next slide, please, Paul. So we're going to very quickly touch on the development in artillery. Now, I note that this is not World War I TV just yet. It's not Civil War TV, and it's not medieval times, although they may well be franchises for you in the future, Paul.
Let's hope.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I do want to just show some props. So hopefully you can see that. That is a, there we go. That is a solid shot anti-personnel cannonball fired in Gibraltar during the Great Siege of Gibraltar, so 1779 to 1783. This would have been fired from a floating gun battery against the defenders in Gibraltar, and it would have been fired from a French, from the French or Spanish. We don't really know which one, but this was located in situ at the base of Glacis near the Great Inundation. It was presented to me. I haven't found it and stolen it.
Wow.
Did some work for the Gibraltar Regiment, was given to me. But how did we get from this solid anti-personnel cannonball to this? This is clearly it hasn't functioned correctly, but this is a 105 millimeter shell fired from an L118 light gun, so probably fired in the 80s or the 90s. This is meant to explode into 1,000 pieces of burning hot metal, so this hasn't functioned correctly. But you can see that we've progressed to a more conical structure. Yeah. It's got a flat base for the propellant to make the most effect against there. It would have had a fuse on top, and it's got a hollowed out center for the high explosive content. The key thing is this copper driving band. Hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
Now that bites into the rifling of inside the barrel, which is what imparts the spin and stability on the round. Now, as I said, I'm not going to cover off the 400 years that enabled us to get from that solid shot to an HE shell. But the reason why this is important is because we've changed from firing over open sights in a direct fire roll, as you would expect at somewhere like Waterloo, and we've progressed to firing on a parabolic trajectory, which is arcing trajectory. So why is it important to this presentation? Well, it gives rise to the forward observer, because we're now firing into dead ground, we're firing over structures, and on occasions we're firing beyond the line of sight. So we need somebody forward who's going to observe that forward shot and make adjustments for us. Next slide, please. Right, so we're going to touch on now what we call the deep battle, and we're going to start off with a geographic framework. This is a little bit technical, so I'm going to go over this with light touch. If you want to go into more detail, then please let me know and we can. So if you just build that, please, Paul. Next slide. So here we can see the geographic framework overlaid on the terrain. And what we really focus on predominantly is the close battle. All books tend to be about the close battle, which is, where our fighting component are within direct fire weapons ranges of the enemy. That's called the close battle. Everything behind the enemy's front line is the deep. So for us, that is our deep battle, but it's the enemy's rear. What we want to do as the division and the corps is to have an effect in the deep in order to shape the close battle. Hopefully that makes sense. Behind our own front line, we have the rear, and our rear is where our sustainment and our, our logistics echelons are located, our command and control, etc. So if you build, please, Paul. So here we can just see a scenario where we've got a defensive formation, and the enemy are going to attack from the top of the slide down to the bottom. Just build, please, Paul. If this happens where the enemy have advanced onto our position without being attrited or disrupted in any way, and they reach that close battle without having any disruption, that is failure on the part of the division and the corps. Okay. That is often during World War II to a lack of what we'd call ISR. So being able to see into the deep and pick up these tracks before they attack us. So if you can build again, please, Paul. And again. What should happen is that we identify the enemy advancing towards us. The corps and the division are then striking the enemy in the deep and disrupting their advance. The key point is that we never want a fair fight. We never want to fight the enemy at full strength. What the division and the corps will try and do is write down the enemy's combat effectiveness. They will try and disrupt their logistics chain. So as you said, as we said before the show, actually, we were talking about the tanks who were able to advance, but their supplies were disrupted, which meant they couldn't be resupplied with fuel and ammunition, etc. That's exactly what we want to achieve. Ultimately, what we want to do as the corps and the division is hand over the battle to the brigades in the close battle and say, I have attrited the enemy to 75% combat effectiveness, for example. I have destroyed a number of the enemy's batteries, and I've disrupted their supply chain. We never want to have a fair fight. We always want to tip the scales in our advantage.
And just reminding me of yesterday's show with Peter Hart, when we were talking about the 25-pounders of the South Notts Hussars in the Knightsbridge box in the desert, is that the system has already failed. If tanks are bearing down 50 yards away from the barrels of 25-pounders, the system has failed. And yet, out of these stories where the system has failed are, in a sense, the most famous stories of Royal Artillery. It's almost the ones that we talk about, the ones where the gunnery's bravery has been paramount, but actually the system has failed. That's a weird. I suppose the same applies to infantry. Those last ditch Rorke's drift type things, because the system has failed in a sense. The dramatic last ditch stands are what we talk about, but they aren't reflective of a system that's working.
No, you're absolutely right, Paul. And ultimately, it comes down to the sensor to shoot a gap. So we need to be able to sense and identify the enemy earlier, which gives you time to then attrit them and disrupt them. If you don't have those capabilities and you're not able to identify the enemy early, then essentially they are closing that that gap quicker than you can react. And so they're already on top of you. You don't have the ability to attrit them.
Okay.
We can build again, please, Paul.
Yep.
Okay, this is very quickly just looking at what tools they would use at the divisional and corps level. So clearly we've got our guns. We're going to talk about that. But what you also have is bombing and ground attack aircraft. Now, the issue with bombing, even though it's supremely powerful, is that it is only attributed to you for a small part of that time. So whether it's either a certain portion is sliced to you or whether you're given a priority for a certain period. If a higher priority comes along, those assets will be ripped from you. Also, if the weather's poor, they're not flying. As you'll know about day 2 on Operation Lutich at Mortain. The fog was in, the ground attack aircraft couldn't get going, and therefore they're completely useless. But the asset which is always there is going to be the artillery. It will always be able to engage, and it will always be able to attrit the enemy. And therefore, I would argue, if you ask a divisional commander and a corps commander, who is the god of war, they may well say to you that artillery is my god of war. That's an argument from authority, but I'm going to stick with it.
That makes sense to me.
So what are we looking to strike in the deep? So ideally, what we want to do is disrupt the enemy's command and control. We shorten that to C2, but command and control. Included in that is his ability to communicate. So his signals, rebroadcasting stations, etc. We've spoken about logistics, but when we're talking about weapon to target matching, we really want to strike soft skin vehicles, wheeled vehicles, and generally logistics tend to be those types of vehicles. And obviously in the German army, you're seeing a lot of equine power as well. Artillery is perfect against those targets. We also want to strike their fighting echelons. And ideally what you want to strike is something like the Armored Mobile Reserve. If you can strike an Armored Mobile Reserve, especially as they're going into a forming up point, for example, they're in that forming up point because they're about to be launched to either reinforce success or to buy out risk because they're failing in an area. If you can disrupt them, attrit them, cause damage to them, delay them getting to that line of departure, then you're only going to help that close battle. The final part, though, is artillery. I want to elevate this to like a level of warfare which people don't necessarily talk about or think about, which is the artillery duel. And of course, I would say this is like, it is the battle to the death. It's the most important thing. Artillerymen and women are looking to strike other artillerymen and women. We are looking for that counter battery battle. The issue is, though, until those guns actually engage, you don't know where they are. They are masked. As soon as they fire, they are now unmasked, and you can start to identify where they are. And we do that through a series of sound ranging and flash identification, but you can start striking their artillery. That is the counter battery duel. Hugely important. And guess what? The enemy gets a vote as well, and they're trying to do exactly the same thing to us. So when we fire in support of our own forces, or when we're trying to conduct a deep battle, the enemy are also trying to identify where our gun batteries are as well, and they're trying to do the same thing. Next slide, please, Paul. Right, so that's the deep battle. That is quite a quick canter through, because I know you said you want to keep this down to about an hour or so. The points I want to make about this is that when you're reading history books, generally they will focus on this element here that you're seeing. The infantry company, you will have established the relationships and identified those individuals because that sells a good story. They've just fixed bayonets. They're waiting for the enemy to come upon them. But what the book doesn't necessarily convey is that for the previous couple of days or even weeks, the enemy has been absolutely malleted by artillery, by bombing, by ground attack aircraft. You will never, or you should never, encounter the enemy at full strength. they should always be attrited. And actually, what books don't necessarily cover as well is that by the time the enemy are upon you, they would have encountered, mechanical failure. So let's say in the book, they're looking at a start state where this enemy formation has 60 tanks. By the time you actually encounter that formation in reality, they've probably lost 10 before they even get to the start line through mechanical failure, and another 10 hopefully through being struck by ground attack aircraft or by artillery, etc. So it's just something to consider when you're reading these books. They don't necessarily factor in that these forces have been attrited to such an extent.
Brilliant.
Okay, next slide, please, Paul. Right, Paul, you're going to be my forward observer in this instance. I haven't told you about
I
this.
don't need maths for that. As I talk about history, maths is not my strong thing.
Well, luckily me neither. So you're my forward observer. You're sat on the hill at Mortain. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do anything. And you've set up your OP and you're there with your team. You've got 4 of you together. So you've got your assistant, who's your bombardier. He's the wily, the guy who's been there and done it. You're the officer, so you're the one who ultimately makes the decision. But you're very heavily leaning on your assistant. You've got a signaller there who's there to clearly articulate your fire orders to the CP, and you've got someone who's there to make you a cup of tea as well. So you identify a enemy armored column coming towards you towards a crossroad, and it's got dismounted infantry. You think, brilliant, this is time for me to earn my pay, target-rich environment, let's get a call for fire going. So I've just made up these call signs. So you're going to say, Golf Juliet 10, this is Golf Juliet 23, fire mission battery, over. The guns suddenly spring into life. They are ready for this fire mission. This is what they're waiting for. They're now stood to attention in the trails behind the guns, waiting for the next packets of information. The CP are on alert. CP are going to basically repeat what you've said to you. I should never say repeat on the net if any gunners are listening. I do apologize. You will then complete the packets of information. So you'll give a direction to the target and you'll give a grid. So direction 800, a grid, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a 7, 8, over. They will say that back to you. You will then give a target identification plus the method. So you'll say something like armored column supported by dismounts. At my command, a 5-round, fire for effect. They will say that back to you. The guns are getting ready. The CP is preparing all of that data, because it's not just a case of pressing a button and the guns are laid and loaded onto that target. They are now ready to engage. They've told you they're ready and they've given you a time of flight. You've told the guns to engage. You've given them the executive order. Fire over, fire, out. They have engaged. They've told you the time of flight. They've reported shot, and you're now waiting for these rounds to land. You've told your team, splash, look in. You're looking through your binos at the target, which is approaching this crossroads that you want to strike. You're looking at your stopwatch, anticipating these rounds causing untold damage amongst those armored vehicles. But unfortunately, your rounds have missed by 500 meters. So why have they missed, Paul? What have you done wrong? We're going to talk about that now. So there are lots of errors when it comes to gunnery, and that doesn't necessarily mean human errors, although that can also happen. We're talking about errors which are caused by things we call the non-standard variables. So if you look at on the left-hand side of this small diagram, there is a gun which is aiming at the aiming point, which is at the center of this cigar-shaped lozenge there. If you were to aim at that center point of that lozenge and you fired 100 rounds, you could achieve rounds landing at the very far right-hand side of that lozenge, and also rounds landing at the very extreme left of that shape as well. And they will land everywhere in between. Artillery is an area weapon. You will not get 2 rounds that land in the same place twice on purpose. So let's move on, please, Paul. We're going to talk about all of the factors now which are at the gun end, which impact the performance of that projectile from the gun to the target end. And the first one is projectile weight. If you could move on, please, Paul. So you would expect projectile weight to be uniform, especially with modern artillery, but that's not the case. You can see that in this example here, the thickness of the shell may vary. So it'll only be a slight variation, but it will all have an impact.
Yep.
The HE fill might be different as well. So it might be to a slightly different capacity, or it could also have not set correctly. All of these variations will cause that projectile to perform in a slightly different way. It's only very marginal.
And I'm assuming, Rob, in World War II, the number of manufacturers would be much greater than you're serving now. I'm sure your ammunition is coming from probably one central source. Well, back then, normally you might be getting ammunition from Canada, from USA, theoretically, especially with tank shells, 75mm, things like that. So I suppose the variation in the explosives as well, the recipes, the ratios, that's in World War II, that's going to be massively wide, I would think.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see that through the failure rates of rounds in the First World War. That was artillery on a huge scale, and rounds did fail. So you can definitely say that the HE content and the construction of those rounds would have been different as well. Yep. No different in World War II. Okay. The next one is calibration. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail because it's not particularly interesting. Sorry, if you can just go back.
Sorry.
Okay. So calibration essentially is all recorded on a harmonization plate on the gun. No two guns are the same. There are very slight variations between the guns as well. An example of that will be the droop of a barrel. And you never want a droopy barrel, Paul, do you?
No, I don't want to go to the doctors. No, definitely not. Yeah.
Some guns are more droopy than others. Okay, so that's calibration. The next one, if you could build, please, Paul, is charge temperature. So there will always be variations in the charge temperature. And essentially, when the charge is exploding behind the projectile, because that's what it is, that is a chemical reaction and nothing more, really. If you add heat to that chemical reaction, it's more energetic. So a quick vignette, if you're in the desert, Peter Hart may have spoken about it yesterday, if you're in the desert and you fire a mission from the same location onto the same target at first thing in the morning, and we know that evenings are very cold in the desert, those charge bags are going to be very cold. If you fire the same mission in the midday heat, the sun's full blazing, you're going to achieve different ranges between those missions. When the charge bag is hotter, the round will travel further. And so before every mission and before every start of activity, you are recording at the CP, they are recording the charge temperature. So it's a factor that goes into their calculations as well. The next one is Coriolis effect. So believe it or not, Coriolis effect, which is the curvature of the Earth, and the fact that the Earth is rotating also has an impact on the projectile. All of these things added together are going to mean that our rounds will never land in the same place twice. The next one we're going to talk about is muzzle velocity. Now, every time that you ram a projectile into the breech, it is biting into the rifling here, yep, which you can see. So these grooves are caused by when this is rammed into the breech, the copper is biting into the rifling. Now, that is a really tight fit. But every time you fire a round through that barrel, you're actually eroding pieces of the inside away. And if you fire 100 rounds through that barrel, the barrel generally starts to wear away and it becomes wider on the inside. What that means, without getting too technical about this, is that the hot gases from the explosion behind it are able to seep around the outside, so it's less effective. What you have, therefore, is a round which will not travel as far in an old gun as it does in a new gun. Does that all make sense, Paul?
It does. I remember those massive, great guns the Germans had, the railway guns in the tunnels up, firing from Calais across the England. From what I remember is every shell was almost custom made because the barrel changed physics every single time that gun fired. The next shell had to be kind of almost, I don't know whether they sanded it or produced it, but it had to be kind of custom fitted because over the course of the firing, the gun changed and aged. Yeah, because it was, I mean, they were massive shells. They were the shells were the size of Volkswagen Beetles, roughly. I think.
Size of cars, yeah. No, absolutely. And so if you have a battery of 4 guns, for example, let's say you have 3 new guns, but 1 really old gun, you will have 3 rounds landing in a similar area, but the old gun will not achieve the same range. And therefore, you can start to get this, what Willie might call a drop shot. That is where that might come from. And that is actually a rogue gun. Ideally, you want to have all the barrels at a similar muzzle velocity. Just on the point about when Willie's calling us a drop shot as well, that refers really to what goes back to the charge temperature. So in the morning in World War I, the rounds would not achieve the same range as they would in midday, for example. If the distance between the front lines is only 100 meters and you're not achieving the same range, you can see that the rounds might start landing in your own trenches. And therefore, they started generating the nickname of the drop shot. It can also apply to someone who's made an error and has loaded the wrong charge, but that is human factors. That is not something to do with the actual mechanics of the gun.
Okay.
In the interest of time, we'll move on. So non-rigidity is really just talking about the fact that we're firing on a parabolic arcing trajectory now. That isn't an equal curve either. It will achieve max vertex height and then drop off. So it isn't necessarily predictable. The final one, which is the most important one, is the meteorological conditions. So if I'm on a rifle range and I'm shooting 300 meters into a side wind, I know that I need to aim off probably half a target to still hit. Can you imagine firing 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers with your artillery and there's a side wind? It's going to throw off your round pool. And that's why you missed with your fire mission. So in World War II, we had meteorological detachments. They would send up weather balloons in the localized area with instruments on them to record wind speed, wind direction, humidity, etc., all these things, which then have to be computed at the command post and applied to this gunnery problem. Okay, that's enough on that, Paul. Let's move on. And again, please, mate.
And do you want us to do a few questions while that came in about? Well, let's do it now before we go into the next part.
Okay.
So, David K is saying, in naval gunnery, in old days of visual spotting, it is difficult to determine the firing correction if more than one ship is firing at the same target. For ground artillery spotting, is this not? I think there's a second part of that question later on. But there's naval gunnery and ground gunnery. Are there differences that you want to explain?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm loath to say that naval gunnery is very accurate. Naval gunfire is very accurate, and the naval gunners will always tell us that one of their guns is equivalent to a whole battery of our guns because they can also fire quickly as well. I think when it comes down to the observation, I'm not a naval gunfire officer, so I don't necessarily know about the observation of ship to ship observation. But really, when it comes to being a forward observer and you have multiple assets, you can't really distinguish between which battery is engaging where and which fall of shot is which. You have to do it independently if you are trying to adjust them, because the rounds will dance up and down that what we call zone, that cigar shape. They are not as accurate as naval gunfire, I'm afraid.
And to continue the idea of naval gunfire, things like 25-pounders, 105s, can they be relined or repaired, or does an old gun just get to the point where it gets replaced?
That's a good question. We actually just replaced them. I don't know if they have relined them previously, but now when we call it XFO, when they get to a certain amount of rounds that have been fired through them, they have to have their muzzle velocity measured again, and they are removed, replaced. Okay.
And then the final one, you may be coming up with this later on, is can you talk about the use of proximity rounds versus high explosive rounds?
Well, really, the round is the same. It's the fuse which is different.
The fuse.
So.
Okay.
Yeah, so the fuse is what determines where the round is going to initiate. And proximity round came in towards the end of the war, but essentially they're mostly mechanical or timed fuses. Most rounds were PD, and you would adjust with point detonation. You would adjust with point detonation as well, because you can observe the fall of shot really easily because it throws up a great big plume of earth and detritus as well. So you would adjust using point detonation. And then when you're talking about weapon to target matching, you would try and use proximity against soft skin vehicles, for example, because that's when you're getting that maximum spread of your fragmentation.
Okay, well, we've dealt with a few questions, so back to you then.
Brilliant. If we, I just put that up there just to convince you. Not only are we the gods of war, we're also wizards and magicians. So what more could you possibly want?
Multi-skilled. I'm loving it. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. On to the meat of it then. So this is the forward observer piece. So we've done lots of technical stuff. Let's move on to the incidents at Mortain. Quick bit on forward observers. So forward observer, quite frankly, is the best job you can do in the army. And I think the only thing that comes close to it is being an Apache pilot, which unfortunately they didn't have in World War II. You are in a small team. You have all of these battle-winning assets at your fingertips, and you are responsible for employing those joint fire assets into your area of the battlefield. I mean, what is there not to like about that? You're responsible for mortars, your tube artillery, rockets. In modern warfare, we're talking about aviation and fast air as well. But then if you've got a forward air controller with you, you would be responsible for calling in those Typhoons, for example, because they would be augmenting your team. The the construct of the team and what sort of vehicle you travel around in is dependent on who you're supporting. I think most people would know that. But on the left, if you're supporting dismounted infantry, guess what? You're carrying your radios, or you may well have a Land Rover to carry your radios. They're not light either. If you're armored and you're supporting an armored squadron, then you need to try and mimic the force that you're supporting, because guess what? The enemy are trying to identify you because you are a high value target. You have the ability to call in these assets to make a difference on the battlefield, and therefore you don't want to stick out like a sore thumb. This picture on the right is quite a famous one. Most people know this from Villa Bocage. This is a K battery observation post vehicle. Yep. You'll see that it's been hit, and you'll see the barrel is there on the floor where it's exploded. I mean, most people know this, but that is a wooden barrel.
Yeah.
The reason it's a wooden barrel is because the space inside is required for extra radios. Not only do you need to speak on the squadron net and perhaps your troop net, you also need access to, the battalion communications, but most importantly, you need your fires net. So all those additional radios are really key, which is why they remove the main armament. Would it surprise you to know that my observation post vehicle from 2 years ago also had a dummy barrel, because I needed extra room for my targeting equipment and my radios? So nothing ever bloody changes, Paul.
No, it makes sense. I mean, and JR on the Soviet assault guns show, there was a point where the Su-85s had a T-34 as a control tank, and of course it got targeted by the Germans immediately, because that was the odd one out. Spot the odd one out and target. Then they changed it to have be looking like all the others. What's the old Irish proverb? When everyone is looking for the fox, better to be dressed as a hound, I think is the one. Isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. No, it's really interesting. And there is a way to tell the forward observation vehicle, obviously, because they will have more antennas sticking up and all that sort of stuff. But if it's not the forward observer, it's probably going to be the command variant. So it's a good vehicle to strike anyway. Yeah. Right. Next slide, please, Paul. We're now going to look at like all the factors that must be considered by the forward observer. And we're going to do that by looking at the case study of the siege at Hill 314 at Mortain. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the background of Operation Lüttich, which was a German counterattack. But in order to frame this part of the presentation, I will provide a bit of an overview. So I'm going to use the account primarily of Ralph Curley, who at the time I believe was a captain, but when he wrote this account, he was a major.
Yeah.
And he was on the hill at the time. And so this account starts off after the launch of Operation Cobra, which was the US breakout from Normandy, as they were heading down towards Avranches. So Curley is from 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, part of the 30th Infantry Division. Right, so the situation as of 2nd of August. The 2nd Battalion was ordered into a rest area in the vicinity of Tessie-Severe. The battalion welcomed this opportunity to rest and especially to reorganize. The fighting around Tessie had been fierce, the casualties were heavy. During this period, replacements were received, the men were paid, given showers and clean clothes. The battalion was completely re-equipped, USO shows and Red Cross wagons were nearby. Replacements had the opportunity to acquaint themselves with the men, the non-commissioned officers and the platoon leaders of their respective platoons. The situation was rare indeed and morale was extremely high. So this is your typical lull before the battle. The men are in good spirits. They're rested. They're conducting personal administration for the first time since, basically since the launch of Cobra. They then move into Mortain. So the order to move had been executed so rapidly that it was impossible for the regiment to secure maps for the area around Mortain. However, the 2nd Battalion S2 secured a few large-scale maps from the 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry, but there was scarcely enough for a whole company. In addition, the company commanders of the 1st Battalion secured their maps from the relieving companies. These had been used for several days. They were crumpled and badly marked, so it's hardly ideal for calling in artillery fire. And we saw how wrong you got it with your fire mission, Paul. The grid is all...
Yep, I know. I really let you down. I'm very sorry. I let you down, let everybody down.
So the artillery observers arrived and registered their protective fires on the 6th of August. So let's talk about registering and recording targets, because I do have a bit of a bugbear when it comes to artillery, and that is people saying zeroed in or I've zeroed targets. You often hear in movies and indeed on podcasts, people saying, they've got us zeroed or the crossroads was zeroed. That is terrible phraseology to a gunner. If you want to give a gunner the warm, fuzzy feeling, you'd say we've recorded targets or we've done a registration shoot or we've registered targets. So what would be likely targets? What are really good targets to look at? And it's all common sense. Main supply routes, crossroads, even dead ground. Even though you can't necessarily see into the dead ground and the fall of shot, you know that is going to be a really good location for an enemy line of departure or forming up point. So you can still use that. You can still use that as recorded information. And when it comes to actually conducting that, those sorts of missions, you can either observe the fall of shot, even though there's no enemy there. You can still order the guns to fire into that area, and you know therefore that you've adjusted those rounds exactly where you want them. And you can record that as target information. So the next time you need to engage in there, you can just order the guns to engage on that target information. You know the rounds are going to land there, assuming the meteorological conditions have remained the same.
And just a vague question for you that you may not be able to answer, but in my talking to World War II veterans, there were some people that were unashamed map guys. They were just good at, visualizing a battlefield. To be a really effective forward observer, is that a requirement? Can you train that? Can you train someone?
Supremely important. It is supremely important. If you can relate the map to the ground that you can see in front of you, you will be able to quickly identify the grid. It's very easy sometimes to confuse one church steeple on a map with another, or a crossroad with another, or to become disorientated. What an OP will do, and I wasn't going to touch on this, but we can talk about it now. When you go into your observation post position, you will draw a sketch map, and you will make sure with 2-man checks that, that steeple is definitely this grid, isn't it? Yes, boss, it's that grid. This crossroad is what grid have you got? Yeah, that's what I've got. You will always do 2-man checks. And an OP should never have one person in it, really, because there should always be those 2-man checks. If I'm
sorry to interrupt, but if you're looking at kind of wide open fields, and perhaps in 2 miles of distance, you can see a church tower, and then maybe 200 or 300 yards ahead of you is a road cutting across your front. But that dead ground in the middle, perhaps it's all the same contour. There's nothing in it of any feature. At that point, if there was enemy force moving across that's where your own eye is going to be important, because you can see where they are, but there's nothing to connect them with on a map. And that's where, I remember that meeting a guy who was, I think he was he was definitely American Mortain in World War II, and he was an excellent golfer after the war because he was really good at getting. He was able to bore sight, his 51mm mortar, 57mm mortar, and on the golf course, he was really good at just without even reading a book about how far the hole. He could just go, and he would just know it instinctively. So it's
judging distance is a really great skill to have, and I have to say, soldiers are better at it than officers, quite frankly.
Good. Well, I'm glad you said that. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt that. I'm just trying to for the people who are watching this who are complete novices in this. I mean, I'm not a novice in the sense I understand what artillery does, but you're taking me through this really well. I'm really loving it, and so are the viewers. So back to you.
Oh, if it is too much detail, then please let me know.
No, we're good. We're good. We're keeping up. We're just trying to pay attention. That's all.
Okay. But you're absolutely right. That ability to relay what you're seeing on the ground to a map is absolutely key. Being able to judge distance, again, a really great skill to have. And like I said, soldiers are definitely better, in my experience, than officers at doing that. But there are other methods that you can employ. Like, for example, you can adjust a mission from a known point. So if you know definitely that church steeple you referred to in the far ground, you will know what grid that is because you can see it on the map. Yeah. You can work your way back because you also know where your location is.
Okay.
Or you also know where your location is, so you can give a bearing. Okay. But again, we're getting pretty technical. So back to our story then. So if you can go to the slide, please, Paul. Right. So the German counterattack, which was known as Operation Lüttich, came on August the 7th in the form of a determined assault by tanks from the German 47th Panzer Corps, ordered by Adolf Hitler to capture Mortain and to seize Avranches. And essentially, this was to cut off Patton's tankers in Brittany, correct?
Yeah.
So the Old Hickory Division absorbed the brunt of the 2nd SS Panzer Division's attack, and the epicenter of the fighting was at Mortain. The Germans captured the command post of the Old Hickory Division. Yes, they did, didn't they? They captured the command post of the Old Hickory Division of the whole 120th Infantry Regiment, and that was the hotel, wasn't it? In the town.
Yeah. Everybody who ended up on the hill had essentially been routed out of the town when the first Germans arrived. Before the sun came up, it was still foggy, and at least one of the colonels was captured, and then they just kind of Ralph Curley, particularly, they fall their way kind of back up to the hill. I mean, there had been a few people on the hill because as you said, the 18th Infantry of the Big Red One had been through there, and the Germans had observation positions there. So a few people have been up there because, of course, naturally you would just go up and look up a hill, but the others who found themselves up, they just kind of fell their way back under the suddenness of the German attack, really.
Yeah, definitely. Well, basically, everyone east of the town, several companies of the battalion were now surrounded on Hill 314, weren't they?
Yeah.
And
right.
I believe it's estimated that between like 700 and 800 men were left cut off on Hill 314. But I mean, people will never really know because you would naturally find your way to this refuge in the stream, if you like, as these these divisions are encroaching around you. So you can clearly see here on the map the encircled Allied position on Hill 314. The pictures are of First Lieutenant Charles A. Bartz and I think he was a private at the time, Frank Denius, but he later became a staff sergeant. But there was also another observer on the hill called, sorry, that is Weiss. There was also Bartz was on the hill as well. Bartz, I'm not really going to go into what happened to Bartz. I understand that he became incapacitated and didn't take part in the conflict, but he did still receive the Silver Star. There's a bit of conjecture around his actual involvement, and I don't necessarily like to criticize veterans, especially.
It's an old one, that one, isn't it? Yeah, he gets different portrayals in different books I've read, but yeah.
But what we will say is that Frank Denius was on that hill, Rob Weiss was on that hill, and they were essentially the two observation parties. They had two radios, and they were there to basically use the artillery to beat back this German assault. Next slide, please, Paul. Right, so what a great view that is. That is actually a view from the top of the hill there looking southeast, I believe. So from their vantage point, they enjoyed clear views of the German movements on the roads below. Their radioed instructions unleashed devastating American artillery salvos against the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, not only degrading enemy assaults on the hill, but compromising German efforts to drive on Avranches. So remember back to the deep battle slides, and the observers would have been, weapon to target matching. Well, the whole point about this is that they were using their artillery to target the supply chain that we were talking about. So all of those soft-skin vehicles, horses especially if they were there, but all of these soft-skin vehicles and wheeled vehicles would have made rich pickings for their artillery. And what a commanding view from that hill as well. Absolutely perfect. Next slide, please, Paul. So on the 7th of August, again, this is the account of Curley. This is all his own words. The dawn was accompanied by dense fog, so dense, in fact, that some of the units on the hill thought that the enemy was smoking the position. By 0800 hours, the sun had burnt through the mist and revealed columns of enemy armour and dismounted infantry streaming from the southeast. So that's more likely the D907 in the vicinity of Bel Air. I mean, you've been on the ground there, Paul. You'll probably know better.
Yeah.
But when you look at the topography, this must be true, because when you look at the high terrain there, you can see that there's a real risk of having a terminal cresting event, and that means that if you're firing over a hill, you could well hit that occupied hill where our own friendly forces are. Especially at the ranges that these guns would have been firing at. I think they probably would have been towards the max end of their range, certainly 5 to 10 kilometers in some cases, which means the trajectory would have been quite low. It wouldn't have been as arcing or a high angle. So if the artillery is engaging over the hill from the west, there's a real possibility of terminal cresting issues, which is, as I said, the rounds hitting as they're trying to hit the reverse side of the slope. And so most of these fire missions would have been fired to the north and the south side of this hill for that very reason. And we call that lateral separation, so a bit of deconfliction. If they knew there was a risk of these rounds hitting an occupied crest, they would have tried to avoid doing that. This is through the perspective of the forward observer. Back to the account then from Curley. So whether the enemy was ignorant of the fact that Hill 314 was occupied, or they'd just simply chosen to bypass it, is not known. His closed formations made a definite target for artillery. Corps artillery was called in, and the casualties and the damage to their vehicles was incredible. The undamaged vehicles quickly dispersed and withdrew. The artillery and the cannon observers registered additional concentrations, and now a solid ring of artillery fire could be fired on call. If the enemy had not known before that Hill 314 was occupied, he certainly knew it now. So let's talk some numbers then. So although Weiss and Denius were forward observers for the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, they would have been able to call on the whole 30th Division for support, and that is essentially up to 12 battalions worth of of batteries being able to.
And the 9th Infantry Division's artillery as well, I think. It was over to the northwest, kind of north of Juvigny-le-Tertre. I'm sure they brought in the 9th or the 30th, relaying information to the 9th. Possibly, I'm pretty sure the 9th Infantry's artillery was involved.
Brilliant. Well, that's a hell of a lot of firepower. I mean, just with 30th Division alone, you're probably looking at 140 tubes. And if the 9th Division are involved as well, Paul, it probably would have only been their 155 millimeters, because they would have had the range to achieve that. I think the 105 probably would have just missed out.
Yeah.
But in total, they fired 193 fire missions during this defense. I mean, the accounts say that every 15 minutes or so they were ordering another call for fire, which is just staggering. I can't get my head around it. I can't imagine such a target-rich environment to warrant.
I'm going to ask another question, and you may be going into this. When you gave me my theoretical scenario earlier, and you said there's a column approaching a crossroad. So Robert Weiss is in a position where he can maybe see 2 or 3 different columns of approaching Germans over different roads. He can maybe ascertain what vehicles are in them. He wouldn't necessarily know from his distance whether it's an SS unit or a Panzer unit, whatever it would be. Yeah. Is he making the decision about the priority of which target to engage, or is he giving the options to someone further up? Because he's only a second lieutenant who is making the decision. I mean, would that situation always be the same? Does the second lieutenant observer outrank in this sense the gunnery commanders behind, or is the decision being made behind him?
This is the difference between the US doctrine and British doctrine. So in British doctrine, the guns will respond strictly in accordance with the intention of the originator, regardless of your rank. If you're calling for fire, you're the one who's made that determination on the ground, and you'll be allocated resource depending on priority for the wider battle space. For the US system, they leave that decision-making process at the fire direction cell or the joint fires cell.
Right.
So it may well be that, the joint fire cell and the fire direction cell are very aware of the situation they're in, and therefore they are allocating them everything. If they're saying they've had core fires allocated to them, then they know their priority. But you're right, it's an interesting question. I think for the British Army, our observers tend to be captains. In the US Army, they're slightly more junior. And that decision is taken away from them in some regards.
And again, this theoretical column, I mean, and you can answer this from your experience, or you can kind of project to what you think these guys were done in World War II. Would you direct your guns? Okay, there's the variations that we're going to allow for. The first ones may not hit the target, but would you go for the front of the column? Would you go in kind of the middle of the column and then kind of scatter it and then isolate the front part? Would you try and ascertain where the fuel bowsers are and where the tanks are? Who makes that decision, and how well would someone like Weiss or his British equivalent be trained in identifying the weak spot of advancing column, so to speak?
Well, I think it comes back to weapon to target matching. So you try and I don't think artillery realistically would have a great deal of effect on armor. I don't think a Panther would be troubled by rounds landing in and around it. A direct hit would be different, of course. But I think in reality, what you're doing as a forward observer, noting the fact that the fall of shot is or can be so dispersed, you are just trying to get those rounds in and around the target area to have an effect. If you make them move or disperse, you're still having an effect on that enemy. Ideally, you want to try and achieve an M kill, a mobility kill. But really, I don't think you're going into that much detail. You're just trying to get rounds on the ground.
Just smother it. Yep. Okay, fine. Thanks.
Try and mallet it. Next slide, please, Paul. So this is the view looking west this time. So this is looking along the D977. I think Paul towards Overranch. Nice straight road there.
I think so, yeah.
So back to our account then. So this is on the 8th of August now, which is the 3rd day. So the 8th of August was fairly quiet. The enemy made no serious attempt to take the position. He continued his attack by bypassing the hill. The observers on Hill 314 had all-round observation and made the most of it. The enemy supply lines and rear areas were constantly harassed by our artillery, which sort of goes back to your point, Paul. It doesn't look as though they're actually targeting the armor, because they know that they're not really going to have much effect against armor, but they will definitely disrupt the logistics tail.
And it's also working as part of a system, because without going into too much detail about Mortain, there were those towed tank destroyer units around the vital crossroads and bridges. So in a sense, if the tanks the German tanks get ahead of their rear echelon, then the tank destroyer units that are well deployed around the railway track in the Abbey Blanche and the other ones further north in Julian, etc. They can deal with that, and then any that survive that, they're going to run out of fuel, they're going to run out of the ammunition, because the rear echelon is then being hit by the artillery. So theoretically, you're dealing with the two parts of the advancing column in the two best ways for of eliminating them, I suppose.
Yeah, 100%. And it's almost a precursor to the bulge, isn't it? Where you have it doesn't necessarily matter how deep your armored penetration is into the defensive position if you're isolated and you can't resupply.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to be abandoning your vehicles because they're in just a pillbox. Okay. And it does look as though they were bypassing the hill and trying to project their forces forward to Avranches. If you can't resupply them, then they're useless. They're going to be picked off. But can you imagine calling fire on a road like that? It'd be brilliant, especially if you can identify the crossroads. That would be, and this is really crude to say this, and lots of really bad things happened on that hill, but this would be an observer's delight, quite frankly. And I think it's a huge precursor, an indicator of what was to come at Falaise.
No, definitely. No. When I talk about Falaise, I have to talk about Lutich first, because to me they're the first and second halves of the same football match, and you can't look at one without the other. It all connects up. Although, of course, further up that road, coming up from the southwest, is the elements of the French Second Armored Division and the Moroccan troops at the front. So you don't want to go firing too far down that road, otherwise you do blue on blue. But that's just another detail for another day.
There you go. We're going to come on to blue on blue actually in a second. In the interest of time, I'm probably going to skip through some stuff I was going to do about the surrender proposition and things like that.
But we can do it. No, let's go because it's really cool. Yeah, we've got time. I'm enjoying it. It's fine.
Okay, cool. So back to the account then. So Curly's talking about the wounded here, and he says the wounded were collected in each company and placed in slit trenches. They were made as comfortable as possible. However, there was no medical aid available. Presence of dead did not serve to raise morale, as you'd expect. And since most of the dead were in exposed positions, it was necessary to wait until dark to go and collect them. They too were placed in a central location in each company area, and they were out of sight. So then although the men knew the bodies had not been recovered, they could not see them, which would have helped. And so, as I said, a German officer approached on the road, the southernmost road, I believe, in a tank with a flag, and he basically had a surrender proposition. Under the circumstances, he said it would not be a disgrace to surrender, and he promised that the men would be well cared for if they were wounded, and he'd provide aid, as much aid as they possibly could. An armoured formation in the advance providing aid and setting up an aid station, I can't see that happening. His last promise was that if the offer was not accepted by 2000 hours, then he would blow the battalion to bits on the hill. So from my understanding, Paul, is that the platoon commander relayed this to the E Company commander, and the E Company commander said something which is quite fruity. Won't necessarily say it here unless you want to say it. But it was better than nuts, as you said in your
it was of similar intent, and the wounded men in the trenches nearby were all saying, "Don't do it, sir. Don't surrender." They were all giving him, adding to it as well.
Yeah, and so the German officer, went to his lines with his tail between his legs. If you move to the next slide, please, Paul.
But you haven't. Are you going to do the story about the bandages though? I mean, as an artilleryman, yeah, good.
I am.
Just checking. Because if you don't do that, I'm going to do it.
No, I'm definitely going to do that. Okay, so this is very slightly technical, so we're just going to cover this very quickly. Right, so this is back to the account. So the enemy then launched a strong attack at approximately 15 hours, so 15 minutes after he just received the good news from Easy Company commander. The battalion ammunition supply was so low that the enemy encountered little resistance other than our artillery. Bearing in mind, this guy's not an artilleryman. He's really bigging up the artillery in this account. Remember, the only persistently engaged and available asset is the artillery. There was no aircraft at this point, I believe. After the enemy had penetrated the position, the Easy Company commander actually called artillery on his own position. And can you imagine how stressful that must have been for Weiss or Denius, whoever that was, to be calling artillery on his own friends? I can't even imagine it. So let's talk about the considerations then when you're calling friendly fire onto your own forces in an attempt to break up an enemy attack. Clearly, you're in desperate measures, and it has to be approved. This would have been approved by the fire direction, sir, which goes back to your point about who's making the call to do this. So I'll just very quickly go for this in the interest of time. But we know from looking at the top graph, the top image, sorry, that the rounds are going to land anywhere along that cigar shape. You cannot predict where they're going to land. So if you've got 3 platoons on the hill, let's say platoon number 1, platoon number 2, and platoon number 3, which is in the diagram below. Platoon number 3 is at really serious risk of a round landing short and impacting on their defensive position. So that's something that Denius and Vice would have been thinking about. You know, what is the gun target line? Am I firing over friendly forces? Am I firing in the vicinity of friendly forces? Platoon number 1, which is the circle towards the top of that diagram, they would have been at threat from all of that throw forward of the shrapnel. Because of the low trajectory, because they're firing at such extended ranges, or almost to the extent of their ranges, it would be quite low, and therefore the rounds are impacting at quite a shallow angle. And the throw forward of all that splinter and fragmentation is going to impact platoon number 1. And so the safest platoon would be platoon number 2 there, that you can see on the diagram. And these are just things that Denius and Vice would have been thinking about. Attack geometry, who is going to be at the most threat, articulating that risk to the E Company commander, just explaining to him, I know you've called in artillery on this position, but these are the platoons which are probably going to be in the most dangerous position. So I just wanted to give you the forward observer's perspective on doing something like that. Right, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on. So next slide, please, Paul. Right, on to resupply then. So in the meantime, the S3 of the 230th Field Artillery Battalion had an idea to relieve the situation. So 10 rounds of M84, which is smoke round, essentially hexachlorophene, would have been opened up. They would have taken out the smoke canisters, and the base ejection charge would have been removed as well. So all the stuff would have fallen out of the cart. The rounds were then filled with medical supplies, bandages, dressings, sulfur, you name it. And the steel disc of the nose was replaced to prevent the fuse from detonating, which is really key as well, because that would have just ruined all the contents inside. Yeah. However, none of these rounds were recovered because they would have ricocheted, because it was dark. They didn't find any of these initial rounds. And this is really important because that is essentially no different to firing any other shell onto your friendly position. That will still kill people. And there is a story, an unfortunate story, where an engineer in Afghanistan was killed by a base plate from a smoke shell. Because once that smoke shell is fired, it loses its ballistic properties once it's initiated, and it tumbles through the air, so you can't predict where it's going to land. Okay. In Afghanistan, one of those components actually hit a soldier, and that was a blue on blue. Terrible accident. Mm. So they must have been incredibly desperate to order this onto their position as well. So on the 11th of August, they started to see the enemy withdrawing. So as soon as the mist lifted on the 11th of August, the artillery again attempted to fire in medical supplies. 6 rounds were fired, and this time all 6 were recovered. But the operation was only partly successful because the concussion and the forces which are put through that round as it's fired were too great for the containers. So anything that was glass in there or any containers was smashed to pieces. So that's quite interesting. You know, they did manage to get bandages over there and things like that, which is obviously going to help them with their aid efforts. But the enemy traffic now wasn't heading west; it was suddenly heading east. And evidently the enemy was starting to withdraw. And the battalion was able to inflict untold damage on the withdrawing columns due to our artillery. And this is really where the air effort comes in as well, but we said we weren't going to focus on the Typhoons. So several airstrikes were also requested, and they were carried out in what seemed like the same time as the artillery. So absolute hell unleashed on the enemy. The Air Corps pounded the enemy columns unmercifully, and the burning enemy columns could be seen for miles in all directions. And this slaughter continued all day. No doubt this is just a precursor to what you'd see at Falaise. Yeah. Last slide, please, Paul. Cool. So this is really the last slide. So when it comes down to supporting arms, again, this is a comment from a guy who's on the ground who has nothing to do with artillery. He just owes his life to them. So I've got nothing but praise for the supporting arms, but mainly the artillery and the air. Had it not been for the artillery, there can be little doubt that the battalion would have been destroyed or captured on that hill. The lion's share must go to the artillery for the successful defense of this hill. They accounted for numerous enemy vehicles and inflicted terrible losses to their dismounted troops. They also literally played hell with the enemy armored columns and assembly areas. They made his supply routes dangerous roads to travel. And that's the account from Curley of the action on Hill 314.
Brilliant. And just to say, you said earlier on about the fact the artillery is always there, whereas air power can be there, but also cannot be there. The thing about the air power in this particular battle is on that first day, August the 7th, when the Germans start crashing into the American lines, that it was almost like the old days, the Blitzkrieg to begin with, because they had the cover of the fog, and the German fire, the air power was not able to get off the ground, and so they were able to do the old-fashioned kind of pushing up with armor and reconnaissance and stuff. And then when the fog cleared, the first kind of strikes against the columns were from air power. There was a place just on the road, the northern road towards Avranches, which was through San Barthélemy. And they, the company had fallen back to a kind of a hedgerow west of the town, and they saw these columns of aircraft come in and knocked out about 90 vehicles in one kind of foul swoop, really. And then, as you said there, the end of the battle on August 11th, that's when the paintings have been set with the typhoons coming in there. But all through the middle bit, when the weather was iffy, as the weather often is around these hills, it's the same in Hill 262 in the Falaise and Montpinçon. Those hilly areas of Normandy are often get the same near Le Hay de Puy, where the fog just sits there for ages and ages and ages, as it was through some of it. And the artillery was the constant. So I can understand if you're there, although you said Ralph Curley was very respectful towards artillery. If you're a GI there, you might kind of remember the early bit when the typhoons came, remember the end bit, but the middle bit when it was artillery, perhaps somehow that got lost in the fog, literally and figuratively. But your point was the artillery was always there, whereas the air power, when it came in, it was devastating and fantastic to watch, but it wasn't always there.
Yeah, exactly that, Paul. I think, and I didn't really labor on the fact that typhoons were decisive in this battle as well, because I wanted to focus on the artillery. But undoubtedly that is a battle winning asset. Same is true today. If you can call in close air support, it's a battle winning asset. So I think the beauty of this and the fact that the deep battle is key, and I want people to take away the deep battle, is that these are layered assets. So you would obviously combine the two, and if you've got both of them, then even better. The enemy's getting the bad news. I just put this in for a bit of a funny at the end.
A giggle at the end. Yeah, no, that's how artillery units are always dressed. That is the number 3 dress. That is.
I can confirm. Yeah.
No, it's great stuff, and as you say, I mean, we talked before going online. The RAF did a study of what was knocked out by what at the end of the Mortain offensive, and the RAF had a vested interest in making the typhoons look good, and they ended up recording something like 80%, 86% of the German vehicles were knocked out by artillery. So if the RAF are saying it was the artillery, it probably was the artillery. Not that the air power wasn't doing their bit, of course, and it was an important part of it. But it was both. It was artillery and, of course, the stubborn defense by the infantrymen when the Germans are trying to get up that hill, and it became there were no fist fights in that battle there. So it's all elements. It's artillery from some distance away. It's air power coming in for a glamorous few minutes, and it's just those stubborn defenders holding on those foxholes for several days. But
just quickly on that, Paul, it's all about complementary effects. So typhoons are great at destroying or immobilizing armor. Artillery is great for destroying wheeled vehicles. If they're complement, and the anti-tank guns which were there on the roadblocks are great, clearly at neutralizing tanks. If you have this complementary layered defense, it's going to work great together. No one asset can do everything. I think that's key.
Well, Willie Robertson is saying, absolute stonking presentation, Rob. We must meet for that beer. So you say you're being very complimentary there. Question from Ian Carr about creeping barrages. So the fall of shot prediction over leads to the question, how did infantry following a rolling barrage in the First World War, or indeed the Second World War?
Yeah, it's a great point. And the reason why you still see creeping barrages in World War II is because they don't necessarily know where the enemy is. So if you can identify an enemy target, you will try and suppress that target area. If you don't necessarily know where the enemy is, but you know they're likely in these hedgerows, or they're likely in this area, you're going to advance a creeping barrage. So you're essentially saturating the ground. We call it battlefield inoculation, but it's really ineffective, especially if you consider the ammunition consumption rate. Really ineffective. Sorry, what was the question about the First World War part?
But how they would follow a creeping barrage? How?
Yeah. So predominantly, you're going to have the rounds the guns behind you as you're advancing, and we spoke about this lozenge and the fall of shot of these rounds, you have to give a very large degree of separation between the advancing troops and the barrage in front of them. Because although the rounds are going overhead and the throw forward will be going forward towards the enemy, you still run the risk of rounds landing short. What's much better is if you can adjust the attack geometry to be at right angles. So if you can be advancing this way against, if the fire is going this way and you're advancing this way, it's much safer because you can lift it. You can lift it much later. So
that's clever.
You want to suppress the enemy as long as you can. Just
to end things, while we've got you on, you know, when you're reading a book about World War II or any war, you know, a general narrative of the battle, is there something that yourself as a gunner find is always a mistake that was always made, or what is the thing that has you hurling books across the room? Is there one particular thing that niggles?
I think
zeroed in. Clearly, you mentioned that zeroed in. Okay.
Yeah, I don't enjoy that at all.
Okay. Well, I must admit I have used that. It's a general term. People on tours understand it, so it works okay. So one last question. I've just got to find it back now. From Peter O'Connell, could History Explorer comment on US development of time on target techniques?
Well, time on target is a method which is in now. We still use time on target. It's a really useful way of essentially identifying the target early, which you have to do. So if you don't know where the target is, you can't do this. You need a refined grid. So you need to know exactly where that target is, and you can adjust fire on it as well. But essentially what you're saying is you're operating to a fire plan, we call it. And so you'll say at H-hour -20, so 20 minutes before H-hour, the rounds are going to land on this target at a certain time. And then you can work out, with advancing forces, you can work out when that fire needs to lift, because you can work out how long it's going to take advancing forces to get there. And so people know when those rounds are going to land and when they're going to lift as well. I think that's what is referring to those.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there. I'm just going to take you off screen for a second, remind people what we've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll bring you back in a second to say goodbye. So, folks, two shows coming your way tomorrow at 9 a.m. Ian McGregor is coming on. It was originally set for January, that show, but for various reasons, we're not being able to get our schedules in alignment, but they are tomorrow. So Ian McGregor is coming on to talk about the myth of Pavlov's house in Stalingrad and Stalingrad generally. Everyone else has heard his presentation, but I'm finally getting on World War II TV. So Ian's a great guy. I can't wait for that. And then tomorrow evening, 7 p.m., Dan is coming on to talk about chemical mortars, which are another artillery weapon in a sense, although Rob may disagree, but they were certainly used in an artillery role in the Normandy and ETO campaign, although originally they were to provide smoke. But Dan will explain what a chemical mortar is tomorrow. So that's the two shows coming your way then. I'll bring Rob back in to say goodbye. Well, I can't wait to invite you back again because it's been fantastic. And I'm hoping people are rushing over to your YouTube channel and giving you a few clicks.
Yeah, check it out, guys. And Paul, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure, and you made it very, very easy. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. So, folks, I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Cheers. Bye.